How do you put a dollar sign on a human life? I mean, I want you to really sit with that kind of uncomfortable question for a moment.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to think about.
No, it's not. Picture yourself opening a spreadsheet, looking at a population, and just assigning a strict numerical financial value to a person's continued existence on this planet.
It sounds completely dystopian.
Right. It sounds horrible. But as we're going to discover today, refusing to do that math, refusing to put a cold, hard price tag on human life is actually, well, it's often what gets people killed.
It's a really profound paradox, honestly. I mean, we naturally recoil from the idea of pricing humanity because it feels like a violation of our basic moral instincts, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
But the thing is, when society avoids answering that question, especially in the realm of global conflict, the result isn't some higher moral standard. The result is that human life is just treated as free.
And free resources are consumed without hesitation.
Exactly. They just get used up.
So that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We're taking the incredibly precise, unforgiving logic of regulatory risk assessment and applying it to the ultimate destroyer of human capital, which is war.
Right.
And our guide for this is this fascinating, genuinely chilling paper. It's called The Fatal Accounting of War, When Land is Priced Above Lives, and it's written by Lev Neymotin, Ph.D.
You know, the author's background is really the key to understanding this whole framework. I mean, Neymotin isn't a political scientist. He's not a military historian.
Right.
He was actually professionally involved in risk assessment related to postulated accidents at nuclear power plants.
Wow.
Yeah, so his entire career revolves around measuring, predicting, and mitigating these catastrophic, large-scale risks to human populations. He maps out worst-case scenarios for a living.
That is intense. Now, just a brief note before we get into the actual numbers. This paper presents the state of discourse in the risk assessment field as presented by Neymotin.
Right. So with that established, we can look at what this analysis actually does, which is taking the abstract theater of war.
Yeah.
You know, the maps with the red and blue arrows.
Right, the debates over historical borders and all that.
Exactly. It takes all of that and translates it into a literal accounting sheet of human destruction. It exposes the core absurdity of how modern wars are fought by, well, forcing leaders to look at the actual cost.
Okay, so to understand how Neymotin calculates the cost of war, we have to kind of back up.
Yeah.
Right? We have to understand how governments calculate the value of life during peacetime. Because the math of peace sets the baseline here.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We need to look at this fundamental tool in economics and regulatory law. It's called the value of a statistical life, or VSL.
Right, VSL. I know our audience is generally familiar with cost-benefit analysis, but, I mean, value of a statistical life always sounds like something an evil supercomputer uses to decide who gets thrown out of an airlock.
Yeah, the terminology is definitely sterile, for sure.
So break down what that actually means in practice.
Well, let's separate the math from the philosophy here. VSL is absolutely not about spiritual worth. It doesn't measure a person's soul or their human dignity or, their importance to their family.
So nobody's looking at a specific guy named Bob and saying Bob is worth exactly $3 million.
Exactly. No economist is assigning a price tag to a specific individual. Instead, VSL is an aggregate metric. It measures what society is willing to pay to make really small reductions in mortality risk.
Okay, so give me a tangible example of how that works. Like, how do we arrive at a dollar amount for avoiding a risk?
Think about it through the lens of wage risk premiums. Economists look at hazardous jobs, right? If a construction job carries a slightly higher statistical risk of a fatal accident compared to a safer job,
the workers are naturally going to demand higher pay to take on that risk.
Right, exactly. So by calculating how much extra compensation a large pool of workers requires to accept a tiny increase in mortality risk, say, like a 1 in 10,000 chance of death, economists can extrapolate that out to a full population.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so if 10,000 people each demand a certain amount of money to accept that 1 in 10,000 risk, you multiply that out and you arrive at the value of a statistical life.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's kind of like installing a stoplight at a dangerous intersection.
Yeah.
The local government knows that specific intersection has a statistical probability of causing a fatal crash.
Right.
But they don't have infinite money to build some massive 100% invincible underground tunnel system to prevent all accidents.
Because that would be impossible.
Right. But they do spend a highly specific amount of money on the stoplight and the sensors and the engineering to reduce the risk. because they can't just treat human lives as a $0 expense.
That is the perfect analogy. And the crucial element here, what's really fascinating here, is understanding why we force governments and corporations to use this metric.
Why is that?
Because without the VSL, decision makers would just treat human death as an unpriced externality.
An unpriced externality. So kind of like how industrial pollution was an unpriced externality 50 years ago.
Yes, precisely.
Like before regulations and fines, a factory could just dump chemicals into a river for free, so they dumped as much as they wanted because it didn't hurt their bottom line.
Exactly. If it costs a corporation nothing to expose you to a fatal risk, they simply won't invest in safety protocols. VSL forces discipline onto the system.
It puts a price on it.
It ensures preventable death isn't just brushed aside as, the normal cost of doing business. It places a concrete, inescapable number on the ledger.
So it literally forces an engineer or a regulator to say, hey, if you design this highway with this specific dangerous curve, you are mathematically costing society X millions of dollars in lost human life, and you have to budget for that loss.
Right. It weaponizes economics to protect people. By making human life astronomically expensive to destroy, you force institutions to protect it.
You make the invisible cost entirely visible. That's really powerful. So if VSL is the regulatory discipline that forces society to protect life in peacetime, the central thesis of this paper asks a deeply uncomfortable question.
It really does.
It asks, what happens when we take that exact same math and apply it to a battlefield?
And this is where the framework fundamentally challenges military tradition. Moten proposes that for international war risk analysis, we have to strip away all that vague poetic language of, sacrifice and glory.
We have to just look at the numbers.
Right. We have to use a specific, unbending metric. He calls it a universal humanitarian VSL, and he anchors this value at $14 million per statistical life.
Okay, I have to pause you right there because $14 million is a massive, very specific number. Where is he pulling that from?
So that figure is firmly anchored to current U.S. federal regulatory practices. Different agencies might have, slight variations, but 14 million represents the heavily researched, state-of-the-art baseline used by modern regulatory bodies to assess catastrophic risk.
Okay, but I really need to push back on this concept for a second, because applying this to war feels entirely different than applying it to a highway project.
How?
Well, by putting a flat $14 million price tag on every single casualty in a conflict, aren't we doing exactly what we said we shouldn't do? Aren't we commodifying human beings?
I get why you'd say that.
You're taking the ultimate profound sacrifice of a soldier or a civilian and literally reducing their entire existence to a cell on an actuarial table. It just feels wrong.
It is a brutal way to look at human loss. And your reaction is exactly why this kind of analysis is so rarely done in public. But you have to consider the alternative.
Which is?
If you refuse to assign a $14 million value to those lives because it feels crass or, commodifying, what happens to the military ledger?
I suppose the ledger just tracks the physical assets, like the cost of the artillery shells, the replacement parts for the jets, the fuel for the tank.
Exactly. And the people become free. The purpose of the $14 million Universal Humanitarian VSL isn't to reduce humans to dollars. It's to prevent political and military leaders from reducing them to zero. Yeah. When a nation goes to war, the Defense Department knows down to the penny what a replacement missile costs. If they don't apply an equal, rigid financial metric to the soldiers firing those missiles, those soldiers become an infinitely expendable resource.
Okay, that completely reframes the issue. You aren't commodifying them to insult them. You are commodifying them to force the generals to acknowledge their worth on the only spreadsheet that seems to matter to them.
Exactly.
But that brings up the word universal in this metric. Standard economics relies really heavily on local context. So why wouldn't you use a country-adjusted VSL?
A standard economist might actually argue for that. They'd say a statistical life in a developing nation has a lower monetary value than one in a wealthy nation, based entirely on local income levels and the domestic willingness to pay for safety.
Right, because a local municipality in a developing economy simply doesn't have the tax base to justify a $14 million expenditure to prevent a single accident.
Yeah.
They have to adjust the math to their reality.
Right. And for building local water treatment plants, those country-adjusted VSLs are a necessary tool. But Moten argues forcefully that for the assessment of international war, country-adjusted VSLs are morally and analytically bankrupt.
Because adjusting the value based on a country's GDP implies that a life from a poorer nation is literally objectively worth less on the global stage, which is awful.
Yes. War is an entirely different domain than domestic infrastructure. A Ukrainian life, a Russian life, and an American life must carry the exact same moral and mathematical weight in this analysis.
They have to be equal.
Exactly. Domestic VSLs just measure what a local economy can afford. But if you adjust the value downward for poorer economies in a war assessment, you're creating a perverse incentive.
You make it mathematically cheaper for those countries to be consumed by violence.
Exactly. The universal humanitarian VSL rejects that entirely. Human destruction must be priced equally at the highest standard of protection across the board.
So it forces the aggressor to evaluate the destruction using a universal moral baseline rather than just discounting the lives of their targets.
Yes.
So we need to take this baseline, now this $13 million universal humanitarian VSL, and apply it to the reality of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I want to be really clear as we go through these numbers. These are not abstract data points.
No, not at all. We are talking about human beings.
Right.
The scale of what we're about to discuss it's just difficult to fully comprehend.
It really is. The estimates we're looking at are from mid-June 2026. And the devastation here mirrors the kind of catastrophic loss you really only normally read about in history books covering the world wars.
Yeah.
But this isn't history. This is happening right now, every single day.
And the fog of war makes exact accounting incredibly difficult, which is why risk assessment looks at the totality of the estimates. Let's break down the ledger.
Okay, we'll start with the Russian military losses. The estimates point to roughly 1.38 million personnel removed from the battlefield. That encompasses the killed, the severely wounded, and the missing. And within that staggering total, the estimates for direct deaths are nearing 500,000. 500,000 human lives just gone.
It's devastating. And the numbers on the Ukrainian side show a devastating toll as well.
Right. The military casualties for Ukraine, again, combining the killed, wounded, and missing, are estimated at roughly 500,000 to 600,000. Now, assessing the direct deaths reveals the friction of wartime accounting, right?
Yeah, the estimates vary.
Western intelligence estimates place the Ukrainian death toll between 100,000 and 140,000. But the official government acknowledgement from Ukraine is significantly lower, around 55,000.
And that disparity is a known factor in conflict analysis. Nations routinely guard their exact mortality figures for operational security and domestic morale.
Sure.
But even using the most conservative verified numbers, the destruction is immense.
And we cannot forget the civilians. There are over 15,000 verified civilian deaths in Ukraine. But every human rights organization and international observer acknowledges that the actual toll is exponentially higher.
Oh, without a doubt.
There are occupied territories and obliterated cities where verification is simply impossible right now.
Right. When you aggregate those figures, the scale of the human disaster becomes undeniable.
You're looking at combined casualties approaching 1.9 to 2 million people. And the direct deaths across all factions easily and conservatively exceed 600,000 human beings.
600,000 direct deaths. We have to apply the universal humanitarian VSL to that reality. If you take those 600,000 destroyed lives and multiply them by the $14 million baseline,
God.
the mortality ledger alone exceeds $8.4 trillion.
$8 trillion.
And that figure only represents the dead.
See, that is the most harrowing part of this entire analysis for me. An $8 trillion loss of human life, and it doesn't even begin to capture the full scope of the tragedy.
No, it doesn't.
That number assigns zero financial weight to the million-plus wounded. It doesn't account for the amputees requiring a lifetime of care. It doesn't factor in the displaced refugees scattered across the globe, the orphaned children, or the profound generational psychological trauma inflicted on millions of people.
It's unquantifiable, really.
It completely ignores the ruined cities, the power grids turned to absolute rubble, the poisoned agricultural land. It is just a staggering, endless consumption of human beings.
It is an incomprehensible tragedy, but from a strict analytical standpoint, generating that astronomical $8 trillion figure serves a vital purpose.
What does it do?
It exposes a fundamental failure in how wars over territory are justified by the leaders who start them. It forces a glaring question into the light. Why do nations trade their single most valuable asset for geography?
Right, because when you stare at an $8 trillion mortality cost, the math of conquest completely falls apart.
Yeah.
The accounting is totally inverted.
It is the ultimate contradiction of statecraft. In the traditional framework of war, territory, national prestige, and historical grievances are treated as priceless.
Like they're sacred objects of infinite value.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the peoples, the actual citizens who make up the nation, are treated as expendable currency used to purchase those objects. But land without people is just soil and stone, A border is just a line drawn on a piece of paper.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Look at what is actually happening in a territorial conflict. You're fighting a war to gain land, and you are killing hundreds of thousands of your own citizens to accomplish it. It's literally like burning down your state-of-the-art billion-dollar tech factory just so you can claim ownership of the empty dirt parking lot next door.
That parking lot analogy perfectly captures the strategic failure here. If we connect this to the bigger picture, modern sovereignty and national strength do not derive from how many square miles of dirt a government controls.
Right, we live in a technological age.
Exactly. True national power comes from human capital.
It comes from the people.
Entirely. A nation's wealth and security are built on science, software engineering, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, advanced manufacturing.
Yeah.
A square mile of captured land might have some, intrinsic resource value, but the trained, healthy, inventive human beings required to build a modern economy matter exponentially more.
So when a country sends its youth into a meat grinder for territorial expansion, they aren't just losing soldiers. You aren't just looking at military attrition.
No.
You're wiping out your future engineers who would have modernized your power grid. You are destroying your doctors, your programmers, your teachers. You're eradicating the fathers and mothers of the next century.
You are literally liquidating the unborn generations that would have made that land valuable and vibrant in the first place.
So they're trading their own future to acquire ruins.
Yes. A war over territory frequently destroys the exact asset the territory was supposed to serve. The human capital is the nation. If you consume the population to expand the borders, the sovereignty you win is entirely hollow.
I do want to interject a critical caveat here, though, because Neymotin's paper is a risk assessment framework. It's not a demand for absolute universal pacifism.
No, it doesn't argue that a nation should never take up arms.
Right. There are grim, undeniable realities where a society might fight because its sheer survival is at stake. If surrendering means facing extermination or mass enslavement or the permanent destruction of a culture, then the risk assessment equation radically changes.
Of course.
Protecting the population from annihilation obviously justifies a defense.
And the framework accommodates that reality. What risk assessment demands is not pacifism. It demands rigorous clarity. It demands honesty from leadership.
It means the people in power have to stop hiding behind vague, romanticized rhetoric. They can't just wave their hands and talk about destiny or historical right or honor.
Exactly. If a leader is going to initiate a military action that will mathematically cost society $8 trillion in pure human mortality, they cannot justify that decision with poetry.
They have to honestly, publicly compare their objective against the actual human cost.
They have to count the consequences, the exact number of lives they intend to spend before the decisions are finalized.
Which completely shifts how you, listening right now, should consume the news. A serious adult risk assessment doesn't romanticize land soaked with blood. It counts the blood first.
Right.
The ultimate takeaway from this fatal accounting is a complete rejection of the standard geopolitical narrative. Stop calling this grand strategy. This is a country burning its people for a map.
And we want you to take this lens with you. The next time you read about a geopolitical conflict erupting, or a border dispute turning violent, or a territorial push being celebrated on a broadcast, look past the rhetoric.
Look past the claims of historical borders.
Ask for the fatal counting. Ask what the human ledger actually looks like underneath the strategy.
Because once you learn to see the invisible cost of those lives, you really can't unsee it. And it leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over.
Yeah.
In the civilian world, we legally require environmental impact reports before we let a construction company build a highway.
We do.
What if governments were bound by international law to publish a public mortality cost-benefit analysis using this universal humanitarian VSL before they were allowed to declare military actions?
It fundamentally changes the barrier to entry for war.
Imagine a world where leaders had to stand in front of their citizens and present a bureaucratic mathematical document proving that capturing a neighboring province was statistically worth the trillions of dollars in human lives they were about to spend. How would that mathematical hurdle alter the global threshold for armed conflict? It turns out the deadliest thing you can do isn't putting a dollar sign on a human life. It's pretending that life costs nothing at all.